Welcome to my presentation on post-traumatic stress disorder, also commonly referred to as PTSD. My name is Nicholas Parasso, and I hope you enjoy my presentation. So post-traumatic stress disorder, it occurs in individuals who have had or witnessed a traumatic event in their lives. Um, Traumatic event being defined as a catastrophic event outside of the natural human experience. So pretty much anybody is at risk for these. Obviously, there are people who are more likely to suffer traumatic events than others, but all people, all demographics are at risk to have traumatic events. Individuals who experience PTSD, some of the defining characteristics of the disorder is that they keep living this traumatic event, whether consciously or subconsciously. Subconsciously happening in dreams, and oftentimes people reporting night terrors. But they experience intense thoughts and feelings related to the traumatic event long after the experience has passed. Um, and a little bit of the history of PTSD. It first kind of started getting recognized after World War One. After World War One, it was classified as shell shock, and then after World War II, they started seeing another reoccurrence of this disorder, and they changed the name to combat fatigue. It's interesting, both of these two, shell shocked and combat fatigue, having differing characteristics as far as what the patients, um, how they express their reliving that experience. And then after the Vietnam War in the 1970s, it started gaining a little bit more traction, and there was a little bit more information characterizing some of what these people were experiencing. And then in 1980, it was first recognized as a health disorder and first started gaining some treatment and some recognition. And so PTSD is pretty common. Nationally, it's estimated that 6.8% of American adults suffer from PTSD. Strangely enough, a lot more women are likely to develop PTSD than men. And I think that has to do with, statistically, there are a lot more women that suffer from traumatic events in the household, such as rape or domestic violence. And then Utah, as far as the numbers comparing to the national average, I wasn't able to find anything directly, but Utah is home to some uh, pretty vulnerable populations for PTSD. One of those populations being refugees from other countries, and there are also many veterans that call Utah their home. Both of these populations are at risk, as they're more than likely to suffer traumatic events in their lives. There are many social determinants for health with this population, a lot of it being support or lack thereof. So what happens a lot with PTSD is people have these intrusive thoughts of reliving this experience. And then what they tend to do is have avoidance reminders. And as they go through these avoidance reminders, or just avoiding these various triggers that might make them have more intrusive thoughts and other things, they tend to isolate themselves. And as they do that, they isolate themselves from a lot of the social support that they may have. And then also, because of this isolation, they're unable to take advantage of some of the community resources that are available. Even though there are few, they are still there. Um, and then also, there's a stigma that comes with any mental health disorder, and PTSD is no different. And so a lot of times people won't seek help, fearing the attitudes and stigma that others might attach to them because of the idea of what PTSD is. And so oftentimes people will um, have a lack of financial security as they don't seek treatment, and as they refuse to acknowledge treatment and address the problem head on and continue to isolate themselves, oftentimes these people are unable to function in society, um, and a lot of times unable to hold down jobs, increasing the risk of financial security. And the greatest concern for these people is psychosocial, but there's also physical factors that come with PTSD, and we'll touch on some of those um, that are more likely in just a little bit. So, as we look at the root causes of PTSD, I think a large part of it is that there seems to be a lack of intervention. So, or early intervention, I apologize. And so, a lot of that is just we don't really have good ways to identify people that suffer from PTSD. So it's estimated that 37 and 92% of adults are going to experience a traumatic event in their life. And so if we take a conservative view, I know that 37 and 92, that's a huge range, but just suffice it to say a lot of people have traumatic events in their lives. And 37, if we go conservative and say 30% have traumatic events, only 6.8% have PTSD. So there seems to be, even there, a wide discrepancy of people that have traumatic events versus those that have traumatic events and end up having PTSD. And so we don't have a lot of screenings to say, oh, you had a traumatic event, like let's go and get some additional screenings for PTSD. And so there's little to identify people that suffer from PTSD besides the self-reporting of the individuals who suffer from it. And because of the stigma associated with that, a lot of people don't go and seek help. And I think that a lot of that can be solved with education. If we were to educate people on what PTSD is and the consequences of early intervention versus later intervention, I think people would be a lot more accepting of what PTSD is and more accepting of themselves suffering from PTSD and seeking um, early intervention. So ultimately, I think a big part of the root cause is lack of education. So if we look at Maslow's law or Maslow's pyramid, the aspect that people from PTSD are hit at most is security, as they're forced to continually relive and re-experience catastrophic events where their security was not fully intact, where they felt threatened. And as we know with the pyramid, if you're unable to fulfill the needs at one level, you're unable to really meet the next level of needs. So with security, it's really low. The only thing surpassing it would be the physical aspect. And so if people aren't feeling secure, they're unable to have social interactions and effectively integrate into society well. They're unable to focus on their own self-esteem and who they are, and really, not that a lot of us do, but it would be impossible for them to reach self-actualization. And so there are a lot of health risks that come with PTSD. As it's a psychological disorder, a mental disorder, depression and anxiety are huge risks for this. Um, Dementia, as well as suicide, are also big things that come with this. And it doesn't help, but I spoke earlier about self-treating, and substance abuse is a big part of that. Oftentimes people, instead of seeking appropriate help, will start to abuse various substances to essentially self-medicate, um, which leads to, it's a slippery slope that can eventually lead to suicide, unfortunately. There are physical aspects that are also associated. You have cardiovascular disease, hypertension, um, being two of them. And then whatever comorbidities these patients have typically get ignored and increase in severity as people refuse to acknowledge the mental aspect of their health. For treatment, there's three options currently that medical professionals turn to. The first in that group is trauma-focused psychotherapies, and there's a variety of techniques to go through that, but essentially what you do is you focus on the traumatic event and give it meaning to your life, and really address it head on and change the dynamic of making it a fearful event to an event that you can learn from. And then there's narrative exposure, where you start from birth and then to where you are currently and create a narrative of one's life and making that event part of the life, part of the narrative and not the entire narrative. And then there's antidepressants. The four antidepressants that are currently used are sertraline, paroxetine, fluoxetine, and venlafaxine. And that is my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.